Let's jump straight into this explainer. We're looking at a massive, high-stakes diplomatic puzzle unfolding right now at the UN over the Convention Against Cybercrime. If you follow global digital policy, you already know that trying to create a single, unified rulebook for the entire internet is pretty much impossible. But this specific treaty? It's fascinating. We're going to lean on some really excellent analysis from Dr. Vladimir Tsakanyan at the Center for Cyber Diplomacy and International Security to figure out exactly what's going on behind closed doors. To really grasp the urgency here, you've got to look at this absolutely staggering estimate from the UN. Cybercrime costs the global economy more than $10 trillion every single year. Yes, trillion with a T. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has actually framed this convention as a vital binding tool to help us collectively fight back against this massive economic drain. He also made a point to highlight this potential value for developing countries, places that desperately need international help and training to defend against these digital threats. So the drive to get a global treaty across the finish line is huge. But here's where things get kind of bizarre. Roughly 75 states rushed to sign this historic document in its very first year. And on paper, that looks like a massive global consensus, right? Well, fast forward to mid-2026, and only 3 states, Qatar, Azerbaijan, and Vietnam, have actually ratified it. That glaring, massive gap is literally the defining feature of this whole treaty right now. So, you've got to ask, why the staggering gap between a diplomatic signature and an actual legal commitment? The clock is absolutely ticking here. The signature window at UN headquarters closes on December 31st, 2026. The practical reality of this global law depends entirely on states stepping up and converting their signatures into binding action. To figure out why they're stalling, we need to take a quick look back at how we even got here. Which brings us to the origins of the convention and a geopolitical shift. See, this whole thing definitely didn't start with a unified global chorus. It actually kicked off back in 2019 with a push from Russia to establish a UN alternative to the existing standard, which was the Council of Europe's Budapest Convention. That's a standard that Russia and China notably never joined. After 5 long years of really heated debate over what should actually count as a cybercrime, the General Assembly finally managed a consensus adoption in December 2024. But here's the twist. The skeptical states didn't block the adoption, but they explicitly said, hey, just because we're agreeing to the text doesn't mean we're actually going to sign it. Fast forward to a special event in Abu Dhabi in April 2026 that was supposed to boost the numbers, and it resulted in basically no reported surge in ratifications. So now, that December 2026 deadline is looming really large. And the geopolitical fractures were totally on display when the treaty officially opened for signature in Hanoi back in October 2025. It was a very mixed bag. On one side, you had signatories like Russia, China, and Iran, but also the European Union and delegations from the African Union. On the flip side, you had major holdouts, most notably the United States. The U.S. mission made it crystal clear. They are unlikely to sign or ratify until they see concrete proof that signatory states are actually implementing the human rights and legal safeguards built into the convention. They even went so far as to reserve the right to reject assistance requests if a state is using the treaty to suppress fundamental freedoms. So let's look at signature versus ratification, the diplomatic distinction. This is absolutely crucial for understanding the mechanics of international law here. A signature is basically just signaling interest. It carries zero binding legal obligation. In fact, some European governments straight up admitted they only signed in Hanoi so they could have a seat at the table and shape the treaty's implementation from the inside, rather than endorsing the current text as it's written. Ratification, though, that's the real deal. That legally binds a country to the text. And for this cybercrime convention to actually kick in and enter into force, exactly 40 states need to ratify it. That 40 is the magic number. And that widespread hesitation to legally bind themselves leads us right into the human rights dilemma: security versus freedoms. Look, to be totally fair, even the fiercest critics of this convention acknowledge it has some genuine, major achievements. Specifically, Articles 14 through 16 get a lot of praise for improving how countries coordinate to fight non-consensual distribution of intimate images, child sexual abuse material, and online grooming. Those are incredibly vital protections, for sure. But those wins are being heavily weighed against massive concerns over sweeping definitions in the text that many argue could seriously threaten fundamental freedoms. The core of this fear really comes down to some very broad language. The convention extends cooperation obligations to any, quote-unquote, serious offense that carries a sentence of 4 years or more. Close to 20 human rights organizations, plus massive industry leaders like Microsoft, are sounding the alarm here. They're arguing that this scope is so incredibly broad, countries could easily use it to criminalize protected activities. We're talking about things like political dissent, journalistic whistleblowing, and even independent cybersecurity research getting swept up in the net. So because of all this, the conflict didn't end at the signing ceremony. It just moved to the bureaucratic battlefield and the Conference of States Parties. In January 2026, the ad hoc committee that originally negotiated the text got together again. The mission was to draft the rules of procedure for how this treaty will actually be run. But they hit a massive wall. Member states completely failed to reach a consensus on how civil society, the private sector, academia, and tech experts should actually be involved in the oversight. It's honestly a bit ironic. A global treaty meant to streamline international cooperation is completely bogged down because the diplomats can't cooperate on the rules for how to hold a meeting. The session ended without an agreed text, and they basically had to rely on a Mexican proposal just to keep the conversation on life support. Now, this isn't just dry procedural drama. This is literally the whole ballgame. They are fighting over the design of the Conference of States Parties. This specific body is a huge sticking point because the treaty's defenders, including the U.S., view this conference as the one primary mechanism where abuses of the convention would actually be caught and stopped. But since its procedural design is still totally unsettled more than a year after opening for signature, a lot of nations are simply refusing to ratify it. Which brings us to the 2026 countdown, the race to 40. Based on that analysis from the Center for Cyber Diplomacy and International Security, there are 3 specific things we need to watch to see if this thing actually survives or just fades away. First, track the actual pace of new ratifications as we get closer to that December 31st, 2026 deadline. Second, keep a really close eye on the outcome of those stalled rules of procedure negotiations we just talked about. And third, monitor the U.S. position for any shifts, because right now they are strictly holding out until they see evidence of those human rights safeguards working in the real world. Now, why should you or I care about this? Because the identity of these early ratifiers literally shapes the rules of the road for the internet. If the convention hits that 40-nation threshold primarily by relying on states with weaker rule of law records, those specific nations are going to be the ones setting the operational norms at the very first session of the Conference of States Parties. The future of your digital privacy is going to look completely different if it's shaped by them versus a broader, more balanced group of nations. So as that December 2026 deadline creeps closer, that huge gap between the ones who signed it and the ones who are actually willing to be legally bound leaves the whole thing hanging by a thread. And it leaves us with one critical question to consider. Which 40 nations will ultimately step up to define the future of global digital law? And what is their vision going to mean for the security and fundamental freedoms of the rest of us? Keep a close eye on this one, because the future of the internet's legal code is being written right now.